Hello there and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and if you're wondering what this channel is all about, well, we take topics from the hobby, whether it's the lore, it could be a book review, it could be something about the hobby itself, maybe a few tips, maybe a retrospective. We take a model that's kind of related to the topic sometimes, but not always. We paint the model, we have a chat, it's all very casual and hopefully entertaining and fun for you guys at home as well. And today we're going to be talking all about the Horus Heresy, because that's a topic which hasn't been covered to death elsewhere. But what we are going to talk about today, which hasn't been touched upon that much, is how significant the Horus Heresy is to us today as 40k players, and how it has somewhat come to overshadow 40k, which is a bit of a contentious point, but I think there are points here that are worth talking about, and stuff here that I hope you guys will all find very interesting. And for today's model, we are going to be painting this model right here. Yes, indeed. And I suppose you must be wondering by now, Josh, why is it every time we do the Horus Heresy, you have to make a Primarks model involved somehow? Well, actually there is a reason for that, and we're going to get to that today. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Okay, now I think it's fair to say that the Horus Heresy novels have been nothing if not absolutely profound. They really have changed the landscape of Games Workshop's IP and completely changed the lore behind 40k in many ways as well. Now that we've had a deep dive that's been going on for many years into what the Horus Heresy actually is and what happened in a lot of detail, it's allowed the 40k universe to have a bit more detail in and of itself. But ultimately, when it comes to talking about the Horus Heresy and 40k, is that there's a bit of a disconnect, almost like 40k is something which now is second to the Horus Heresy, rather than it simply being the continuation, or the Horus Heresy being the springboard onto which the 41st millennium has jumped off. Now, one of the really interesting things about the Horus Heresy, it obviously started off as just a backstory. It never was actually that important in the grand scheme of things. And I remember in the years gone by, a lot of people simply speculated that things like the Horus Heresy Forge World game would never happen. Never mind Primarks, let alone plastic Primarks. Most people simply didn't believe that was going to happen. But over the years, we've seen Horus Heresy go from being the background to being a really critical and core part of the narrative. And there's a few reasons why that is, and we're going to explore them here today. Now, the first thing I want to start off with is a personal anecdote. I have a good friend who is a historian, but also quite likes the 40k. He likes 40k, he likes the Horus Heresy. And he said something very interesting to me a little while ago about the Horus Heresy. And what he said was, the way people talk about the Horus Heresy, you would believe it actually happened. Now, I think that's really fascinating and really interesting, and he's never said that about anything else, not the 40k, not the Time of Legends in the Old Fantasy, not even the narrative of Age of Sigmar, but we'll get to that later on, actually. And it's really telling that the way people engage with the Horus Heresy is very different with how they engage with 40k. And if we look at the differences between them, they're quite stark in terms of how they're presented. First of all, 40k Space Crusade Rogue Trader was a game before it was ever a story, before it was a narrative. It was a very small-scale board game that has grown over the years, partly thanks to the Black Library, but also thanks to its own expansive universe that's existed within the game system. So we've gone from just being, Space Crusade to having the Imperium of Man, the Forces of Chaos, the War of the Orcs, and the Eldar races, Tyranids, etc., etc. But that has all come organically over time, and that's been a universe that has been expanding, granted, and getting wider as time has gone by. The Horus Heresy, on the other hand, however, is a story. It's a journey with characters who have objectives. The 41st millennium doesn't really have that in the same way. When we think about the Horus Heresy, there was always something of a timeline, even going back to before the novels were first released. There was obviously the Great Crusade, there was the Davin incident, then Istvan, then other things such as Prospero and Calth, before we get eventually to the Siege of Terror and Horus's fall. Now, the fact that the Horus Heresy was always considered to be the big turning point for the Imperium, maybe not necessarily the thing that ended it, but definitely the thing that changed it, has become quite a key factor in all of this. But as the years have gone by and Games Workshop has continued to publish the Horus Heresy series, and then Forge World created the game, and now there's Primarks, I think it's fair to say that when it comes to learning about the 41st millennium, the Horus Heresy almost seems to exist as something of a parallel dimension within Games Workshop's own IP. It's this thing which happened before the current 41st millennium, which exists purely in plastic, to the resin and novel-based one of the 31st millennium. And in some respects, I think one of the important things to say why the Horus Heresy potentially has overshadowed the 41st millennium so much is not only is it a story, it has a far greater requirement to keep up and open up people's imaginations. So when it comes to the 41st millennium, obviously it's very clear and very tangible what everything looks like. We can see the Space Marines, we can see their spaceships and all the artwork, we can see the Emperor's palace. We can see what orcs look like, what Tau, Tyranids, Chaos Marines, Blood Angels, we can see what they look like. Now, when they were first reimagined for the Horus Heresy, that was quite novel and quite exciting for a lot of people. But as time's gone by, we've got to understand who they were, what they were like, what their depth was. And then the origin to the Horus Heresy, which I suppose you could call the origin story, which was the Great Crusade and the unification of Terra, started to creep into it more and more in the books. Now, this is not to say that the 41st millennium itself hasn't really had any depth, but what it has not had in the same way is the same exploration. It's not had the same deconstructive approach that we've had when we meet legionaries or Primarks or even just humans living in the times of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. We've not had that in the same way. And the other thing about the Horus Heresy is that it has moved forward. It hasn't stayed static. The 41st millennium, certainly for as long as I've been around, has always very much remained at the 1 minute to midnight point, which a lot of other people have said, where it's always very much been Abaddon's Third Crusade is launching, the Hive fleet Kraken of the Tyranids is arriving, the Orcs are rampaging across the galaxy. It's all about to go horribly wrong. But that's where it's sat for a very, very long time, and that hasn't moved. But the Horus Heresy has obviously always been a story. It's always been a mobile, moving thing. And it has to be said, by Games Workshop's very great credit, and Black Library's very great credit, that they have not played to the ending in the books. Every moment in the series now very much feels like a desperate struggle on both sides. The stakes are high. In the early books, there was actually a risk that they could have just said, well, we know that Horus is going to die, we know the Emperor's going to be wounded, we know these things are going to happen. It's one of those things where they're leaning into the things that we already know as readers, because there's no point acting like it might not happen, but we should understand and actually emphasize the significance of it happening and what it actually means. And that's been a very good and very clever move on their part. Now, obviously, I'm sitting here talking about narrative and story and how it's moving, and the 41st millennium hasn't really had that in the same way with a lot of the Black Library books. There have been stories within the 41st millennium, and to be fair to it with 40k, that's probably the best way to do it, simply because it's not trying to tell the same story. 40k is very much a sandbox setting. There's lots of things going on into it which the players can be dropped into it. It's a bit more interactive and it's a bit more designed to be played in rather than simply saying here's a world which is moving ever forward. Now, obviously, this is going back to the older model of what Games Workshop also with fantasy, where you have a sandbox which we get to play around in, which will ultimately stay the same. And in some respects, it's kind of the difference, if I may switch to video games here, is the difference between The Witcher and World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft is very much a status quo that doesn't move, and there's lots of players doing lots of different things in it. Whereas if you play The Witcher, the story is moving. You are playing a character, and that character has clearly defined personality traits, objectives, goals, strengths, and weaknesses that all change and develop as the game goes along, even though you are in control of the character's movements. You are not only taking part, but you are also a spectator. But obviously in World of Warcraft, it's entirely down to you what you want to do. And even though you are far more in control of what you do, your impact on the world isn't quite as big or necessarily quite as noticeable or as realistically or as significant as it would be in The Witcher, because obviously the world is a bit more keyed to that. And that's one of the differences between Horus Heresy and 40k. But then if I may retract ever so slightly and go back to influencing this, I think it's fair if you're thinking at this point, yes, Josh, we know that the Horus Heresy influenced the 41st millennium. That's the point of the backstory. That's the point of the origin story. Well, that is true. And as the books have gone by, they have created this wonderful narrative where we get to see how the 41st millennium is shaped. But I think what's changed is the things that we didn't know about it before the books started to be published are now starting to become stronger and stronger as Games Workshop leans more and more into it, and I think that's not necessarily a bad idea. And this is where we get to the point of that Primaris Marine as the subject of this video. The first thing to say is that 40k, and to an extent Age of Sigmar now, are slowly becoming more and more narrative driven. With Age of Sigmar's complete reinvention from fantasy, they've been able to lean into that and make the whole thing a completely narrative focused game, where whilst you are still able to do a lot within the game world, there is still an overarching narrative which will move on, and obviously you have to keep up with that, which some people don't like so much, but that is just the state of play. However, if we then look at the actual factions within the 41st millennium now, you're going to start to see a lot of things from the Horus Heresy that are starting to come in more and more now. First of all, the old legions are very much represented in the Primaris Space Marines, who are heavily reminiscent of both the aesthetic and the organisation of the old legions. I mean, come on now, look at Intercessors, Hellblasters, even things like Aggressors, and you tell me that they haven't very much been lifted from the Age of Darkness in the Forge World Horus Heresy game and just put straight into plastic in 40k. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I like Primaris, I like what they've done, but you can very much see that they've lifted one thing into another. And then, of course, there's the return of the Primarks. Now, Primarks getting involved in the 41st millennium was always something people raised eyebrows at and were very skeptical about. Going back 10, 20 years, I don't think anyone would have ever said, we will see plastic Primarks, never mind demon Primarks. That's something which most people thought was simply never going to happen. They simply saw it as backstory. But now they're here. Guilliman's in charge of the Imperium. Mortarion and Magnus are both running around, kicking people in the shins. It'd be very silly to just assume they're going to leave it with that. I think because all three of them came out about 2-3 years ago now, everyone's been thinking this may be it, we may not see another plastic Primarch, but I would be very surprised if we didn't see at least 1 or 2 more plastic Primarchs eventually coming out. Whether it's a demon Primarch or a loyal Primarch is hard to say, but I'm very much convinced we are going to see at least 1 more before too long. But another thing I just want to say very quickly about the Horus Heresy's narrative aspect and 40k's narrative aspect is that now that we have characters like Guilliman involved and Mortarion and Magnus more directly involved, is that they are able to move the narrative and move the world that 40k is set in. If you look back at over the many, many very fantastic and very well written books, none of those characters had the same effect. The Gaunt's Ghost books, the Caiaphas Cain books, Colonel Schaefer's Last Chances, the Uriel Venturous novels, the Night Lords books, none of those books have characters, individually at least, or even collectively, who had the power to really move the story forward. And a lot of the characters who we would probably think as doing that, such as Logan Grimnar and Marnius Calgar and the High Lords of Terror, have always very much sat in the back seat of those books or not been involved at all. It's always very much been characters who we see in looking into this world. And yes, they are very interesting. If we look at the Ragnar Blackmane novels from earlier years in the Gaunt's Ghost books, they give us a good look at the Imperium from the ground up. But those characters never really had the agency to change the Imperium or change the galaxy. But now that we have the Primarchs back, that is what's happening. And the thing you have to remember about the Horus Heresy is that was initiated by Primarchs, by these big forces within the galaxy. Now, you could say that nothing smaller than a Primarch could have instigated that sort of rebellion or that sort of massive galaxy-changing event. But I would like to point out that Abaddon the Spoilers had 13 Black Crusades, and somehow he's always ended up back in the Eye of Terror. Now, even with Aaron Dembski-Bowden's recent, very well-written and fantastic Black Legion novels, we still don't really see Abaddon changing things in those books. He's still very much at the beginning of that journey by the end of the second book. But I think it's kind of high time now that we see Abaddon changing the galaxy in a more overt way, something that fits his status within the 40k that is becoming the standard 40k that we're seeing now. And whilst we're on the topic of the 1 minute to midnight fallacy that has been a long-standing issue with 40k, there's one thing I think is very much worth mentioning, is the Empire on the edge of collapse only works if the collapse happens. Now, if we just ever so slightly shift perspective slightly and look at this from someone who's been into 40k for only as long as the 8th and 9th edition books have been around, you'd be well within your rights to think that the Imperium was doing okay. It's lasted 10,000 years, and I might do a video on the Imperium actually about this, but it's lasted 10,000 years, and it is still going. It may have undergone a lot of trials and it has cost them a lot to stay functioning, but they've endured. They're still there. The Empire hasn't collapsed. The Imperium of Man is still a thing. It's still a polity. It still stands. Terra and Mars have both survived. They've not collapsed. And if going from 7th edition to 8th edition, that had been the case, and then Guilliman came back, that would have been very different. However, over an Age of Sigmar, the Empire and the whole world simply was destroyed and they had to start again, but all the great powers came back. Now, I know that Games Workshop probably wouldn't want to do the same thing twice, but having said that, it's very interesting to see that where they were for so long saying this empire is about to collapse, it's about to collapse, they've now shifted to it's shored up, it's holding. Barely, but it's holding. And I think that was quite a sensible move, because ultimately it now means that the empire doesn't feel like it's constantly on the edge of collapse. That means that the story itself can move in a different direction that doesn't have to rely necessarily on the Imperium collapsing and everything ending there. But now we're drifting into 40k a little bit. So to get back to how the Horus Heresy has also influenced the overall design of 40k, is that's a little bit in change of attitude as well. 40k was the grim dark universe, and it still very much is. But it was a grim dark universe which was very much landed in cynicism and fatalism, and everything's on the edge of ruin. But the Horus Heresy, or the Great Crusade at least, was very much built upon the idea of hope and progress and a bright future for humanity. And even though that's not overtly represented in anything in 40k, you can definitely see that, especially in the Guy Haley novels, which feature Guilliman, starting to come back into it, that there is maybe a kernel of hope, or maybe a sliver of possibility for the future of humanity, now that there is at least one Primarch back and fighting for them, and now that overall the Imperium's maybe got itself together a bit better than it did even just a few years ago in the grand scheme of the timeline. And whilst we're on that, I've sort of alluded to this before now, but like I want to say definitively, 40k didn't have characters that were driving the plot forward because it was a sandbox, but now we have characters who feel big enough to drive the plot forward. It's good to see it moving forward. It's good to see that the universe is slowly changing, albeit almost exclusively from the perspective of the Imperium. It is still a good change, and I think this is going to be still quite early in the grand scheme of how we look at current 40k, because it is still quite new. We've only had this universe with Guilliman in charge and Primark starting to come out for a few years in our time. So time really does still have a lot to tell us about where it's going to go. But I think that when we look at it and how much it's changed, it's very hard not to look at the Horus Heresy and see the parallels as to how the two of them are starting to intersect more. And the thing I want to conclude on today is very much this. I do very much feel that now that Black Library has taken so much of the narrative into its own control, while staying very true to the source material, they've actually raised the stakes on the source material. Games Workshop, I do feel, is reacting a little bit to what the authors of Black Library are doing now more so than they were a few years ago, and that's a good thing. But ultimately, I think Games Workshop have also realised that by having a more narratively driven set of game worlds, they can do more. It can be deeper, it can be more interesting. But also, it's very much a shame that they had to figure this out with the prequel rather than the current story. But now that we are moving things forward, I'm also slightly concerned, or at least cautious, that I feel like a lot of the attitudes of the Horus Heresy, or the things that the Horus Heresy has set up, are going to be more and more prevalent and more present in the 41st millennium. And I do feel that's a bit of a missed opportunity. We're not bringing in new characters, we're not bringing in new ideas, the galaxy itself isn't changing. If anything, it feels a little bit like it might be taking a step backwards to what it was 10,000 years ago, and I'm not sure that's necessarily the best thing, but it's definitely going to change whether or not it goes forwards into something that we've not seen in the 41st millennium before, or maybe it's going to try and bring the attitudes of the Horus Heresy into the 41st millennium more. I'm not sure which is best for 40k, but let me know what you guys think in the comments. As always, I like hearing from you guys, so let me hear your thoughts. So those are my thoughts on the Horus Heresy and how it overshadows the current 40k canon and everything that comes with it. But let me know your thoughts below. Do you agree with what I say about how it has become more significant than the 40k universe itself? Do you think that the 40k narrative is actually more important now, or do you think it does take a bit too much from the Horus Heresy series? Let me know your thoughts below down in the comments. Thank you all very much for watching. Like, subscribe, comment below, all that fantastic YouTube shilly stuff. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.